Hey everyone, hopefully you guys have enjoyed a safe and relaxing spring break. For this upcoming week, we're going to dive into the beginnings of the Cold War. And before we went on spring break, we wrapped up the unit on World War II. And of course, just a brief recap, the United States ends up going to war when Japan bombs and attacks Pearl Harbor, a naval base in Hawaii. And we ensue in a 4 year long war with not only Japan, but with Germany and Italy as well. And at the end of it all, of course, the United States drops two nuclear bombs on Japan, one in Hiroshima and one on Nagasaki, and this results in Japan's surrender. And the United States ends up victorious in World War II. And now we move on into a new era called the Cold War. And we're going to talk about what this all is about. The Cold War was an era of confrontation and competition beginning immediately after World War II between the United States and the Soviet Union. So, after World War II, much of Europe is decimated through all the fighting and bombing and raids during World War II. And so, two nations that emerge as the two global superpowers was the United States and the Soviet Union. And so, for a long period of time, both countries have had a strange and interesting relationship. We've been frenemies for a long, long time. And of course, this kind of still lasts into the modern day. Okay, after World War II, much of Europe, like I said, was devastated physically and economically from the war. And to try to rebuild Europe and support democratic ideas, the United States developed what's called the Marshall Plan, which provided billions of dollars in aid to European countries. So, for example, the United States would be like, hey, Greece, Turkey, fellow European countries, we will give you guys billions of dollars if you turn your government into democracy and democratic ideas. Please don't have dictatorships. And if you have dictatorships, we will not give you any money. And that's basically what the Marshall Plan did, because we did not want, from a US point of view, we did not want another Hitler, another Mussolini to appear. And so at the same time, the Soviet Union rejected American help and started to develop its own economic program. And so the United States was a bit worried of what the Soviets were going to do. The Soviet Union was like, we're too good for American money. At this time, President Harry Truman, who of course took over after President Franklin D. Roosevelt died. In 1947, President Truman proposes the Truman Doctrine, and it provided aid to any country battling communist aggression. And so Truman would literally be like, hey, I will give you guys, same thing to the Marshall Plan, I will give you guys money to not turn communist. And the Soviet Union basically did the same thing to other countries to make sure that they don't turn democratic. The Truman Doctrine, it was immediately used to support the free governments in Turkey and Greece against communist threats. It was basically a competition of who's going to give the most amount of money so that countries can be on your side, essentially. After World War II, the United States foreign policy was to adopt what's called the containment policy. So, of course, when you think of the word contain, you're trying to control it, stop it from spreading. So, containment was the U.S. policy towards the Soviet Union, and communism used to block or contain communist expansion into other countries. So, a lot of the times you'll hear people overlap the terms Soviet Union and Russia. They're pretty much the same country. Of course, the Soviet Union was much, much larger. Once the Soviet Union dissolves in 1991, I believe 15 countries are formed because of that. And of course, Russia is the largest of them all. After World War II, China, which of course is a large nation and currently the world's most populated country, was involved in a civil war between US-backed nationalist government and Mao Zedong's communist forces. So just a brief little world history recap. China during World War II, much of it was occupied by Japan. And of course, Japan loses World War II, so they have to give up all their land or the country territory that they claimed. So now the question is, what does China become now? So that was the big question because they're a huge influential nation. So, despite help from the US, the nationalist government lost and retreated to the island of Taiwan. And to this day, Taiwan is a hotbed issue of whether or not China controls Taiwan or is Taiwan an independent country. So, depending on which country's government you ask, the United States usually, pretty much for the most part, sees Taiwan as part of China, which of course, brings a lot of tension in that region. And later on, the Communist People's Republic of China was formed in 1949, being led by its leader, Mao Zedong. Oh, that is a picture of Mao Zedong. He ruled China from 1949 to his death in, I believe, in the mid-70s, 1975, I believe. So in 1950, the People's Republic and the Soviet Union signed a treaty of alliance. So remember, alliance is a friendship. The US feared that the two countries would spread communism across the globe. And so the United States sees what's going on in China and be like, oh man, we need to try to get an ally in Asia. So what does the United States do? Well, the United States tries to begin to immediately industrialize and rebuild Japan in order to gain an ally in Asia to keep an eye on what's going on in China. So when we think of the Cold War, let me move my screen here. When we think of the Cold War, it's not one huge war that the United States and the Soviet Union fought in. It's a series of basically aggressions and other wars that are all apart during the Cold War time period. And so the Cold War, just a brief overview, basically lasts from 1945 after World War II is over until Soviet Union's dissolvement in 1991. So basically a period of 45 years. So at the end of World War II, not only China, has this question of what kind of government it's going to be into, also Korea on the Korean Peninsula. Because during World War II, Korea was also occupied by Japan. And since Japan had to give up control of Korea, it was basically a free-for-all of what that peninsula will look like. So Korea was split into two at the 38th parallel, which it still remains to this day, with the Soviets occupying the north at the time and the United States occupying the south. So that is why whenever you hear the news, South Korea is more, democratically opened in its government. There's more free trade in South Korea, while the North Korean are led by their dictator Kim Jong-un. And I'm sure you guys have all heard about the news about how they have nuclear weapons. They sometimes do their nuclear rocket missile tests, and it's a basically shut off hermit society. So both the North and the South formed their own governments and claimed the entire country as their own. So this basically leads into the Korean War conflict. And in 1950, the Soviet-backed North Korean army invaded South Korea, nearly capturing the entire country. So because back in the day, there wasn't no South Korea and North Korea, it was just Korea. The United States Army, backed by United Nations troops, counterattacked and pushed the North Korean army to the border of China. And feeling threatened by the advance, China attacked and forced the United States to retreat back to the 38th parallel. So here's a map of the Korean Peninsula. North Korea is in this right over here, and you have South Korea right over here. And so it was basically a seesaw battle, and it looked like it could go either way. Either North Korea or the communist-backed Koreans could have taken over the entire peninsula, but it was a stalemate, a tie, and basically you have now at the 38th parallel basically the most dangerous and secured border anywhere in the world, arguably. Okay, so the two sides eventually signed an unofficial peace treaty in 1953. I mean, there's an argument to be made that because there was no official peace treaty, the two countries are technically still at war, but there's been a ceasefire since the early 50s. The United States then began to build up their military and signed defense agreements with many Asian countries. And of course, there are a couple of military bases in South Korea where a lot of our troops are stationed in. The United States also began sending aid to French forces fighting communist forces in Vietnam. And of course, Vietnam is going to be another hotbed issue between the Soviets and the Americans, and that will lead into the Vietnam War that basically increases its tensions throughout the 60s and 70s. Okay, so back home, the rise of communism. Communism, of course, was the style of government, or not, yeah, the style of government / economic ideas that were popular and used in the Soviet Union and China. And once again, no country in world history ever has been 100% communist or 100% capitalist. There's always been some sort of mixed economy, but for a lot of sakes and purposes in academic discussion, we tend to align communism completely with the Soviet Union. But I digress. But anyways, communism basically is a form of economic and governmental policies that gives the governments a lot of influence and a lot of power on how businesses, how healthcare, how education is run. And so in the United States, the words communism or communist and even socialist and socialism draws a lot of worried red flags. Okay, and this was part of the Red Scare that happened in the United States throughout the 1920s after Russia's revolution in 1917, and it comes back again during the 1950s. And so, because of the Korean War, it gave rise to a new Red Scare in the United States that many Americans feared that communism would eventually take over the United States. And so many Americans felt as though the United States was losing the Cold War because, they thought that, we essentially tied in the Korean War. Americans, we tend to think of ourselves that we need to win everything, American exceptionalism. So seeing that we were at a stalemate in the Korean War, we took that as a loss. And so many Americans wanted a government explanation of why are we losing. So in 1950, along comes a U.S. Senator from Wisconsin named Joseph McCarthy. And he says that inside of our government, in the United States government, there are communists. And so he claimed to have a list of 205 men working for the U.S. government who were members of the Communist Party. And this claim propelled him into the American spotlight. And so he gained a lot of power and a lot of influence just blaming people left and right, whether it's other politicians, other educators, that they are communists, even Hollywood actors of being communist. And so he, stoked into the fears of many people. And that's kind of, similar to what has been going on for, a lot of times after Joseph McCarthy as well. So there's a picture of Joseph McCarthy. In 1952, McCarthy began holding hearings about communism, accusing many people in the government of being spies or communist sympathizers. So sympathizers are people who agree, have a good heart for communism. And so his witch hunt for communists became known as McCarthyism. And those who openly challenged against McCarthy would basically be blamed for being a communist sympathizer. So it was very difficult and very risky to try to blame and criticize Joseph McCarthy, because then he would turn the finger back at you and blame you for being a communist. So many Americans, would rather listen to McCarthy, or they were more afraid of McCarthy than being blamed for being a communist is just too great of a risk. And yeah, that's what happened. So, all good things came to an end for McCarthy. His downfall began in 1954 when he blames the one group that basically turned many Americans off of McCarthy. McCarthy blames U.S. Army officials of being communists. And so that was a huge no-no, and that basically led a lot of people to call out on his bluff and his BS. And that's when he lost a lot of power and influence. And as millions of Americans watched TV, he openly badgered and harassed witnesses during televised hearings. And with pressure from the American people, Congress censored McCarthy's. To censor someone is to basically stop him, to not give him any light whatsoever. And so this ended his political power. And that was the end of that. And so for Joseph McCarthy, let me go back real quick. For Joseph McCarthy, after his downfall, he doesn't live too much longer. I think he passed away in 1957 due to alcohol poisoning, or he had a lot of struggles with alcoholism. All right, so during the Cold War, this brings a lot of domestic changes inside the United States. The baby boom was the period of time after World War II when the United States experienced a massive increase in the child birth rate. So this is, anybody that's born between 1945 and 1961 are considered the baby boomer generation. And I'm sure you guys have all heard, all the memes on the internet. People say, okay, boomer, they're talking about this age group, maybe your parents or grandparents, okay? So 65 million children were born at this time period. And so, people think, well, why was there a baby boom? Why did many children were born after World War II? Well, think of it this way. Many soldiers were, gone at war and didn't get to see their spouses, their wives for a long time. And so when they came back after fighting the war, they were excited to see their wives, and the rest is history. As also, economically, the United States started to become more of a wealthier nation. And so many people were able to afford things. They had money to be able to afford having a child or many children, in fact. So that is why. So, okay, yes, more reasons as to why the baby boom happened. Husbands returning from war, wages were going up, people were feeling confident in the economy. Also, there's a decreasing marriage age, so more people were being married, early 20s, late teenage years. And so, yeah, it gave, rise to having more children. And of course, it helps having advances in medicine as well. So after Harry S. Truman, along comes President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower saw the need for a more efficient highway system to move people, goods, and military equipment across the country quickly. And so he helps pass the interstate, or he signs the Interstate Highway Act, which would eventually build over 40,000 miles of interstate highway that spurred enormous economic growth through car sales, chain restaurants and hotels, and the ability of workers to move farther away from cities. So this is why we are able to have suburbs, because of highways. If you didn't build any roads at all, people would all be stuck in the same place. And also, it helps chain restaurants and hotels. Think about it. If you're ever driving on the highway and you get off an exit ramp, you'll see the first signs that, hey, if you take a left a mile down the road, there's a restaurant or a hotel, or a block away, there's a gas station. So this Interstate Highway Act is able to help grow many different industries. Also, speaking of suburbs and highways, Levittown was basically the very first suburb in America. This was 10 miles away from New York City. And suburbs grew very quickly after World War II because of the baby boom. So, having large families, people didn't necessarily want to be in the middle of the city. They want to be kind of, further out. They wanted to have a front yard and a backyard, and have their kids go out and play. And so this was very desirable for many families. And there were new benefits for buying homes provided by the government to former soldiers as part of the GI Bill. Also, you cannot underestimate the impact of television. Of course, TV has been around since the 1920s, but during the 50s and 60s, many people were able to afford a television, and this was seen as a golden age of TV. And so, when it comes down to politics, the very first televised presidential debate occurred in 1960 between Vice President Richard Nixon, who was vice president for Dwight D. Eisenhower, and then rising senator from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy. So this was very important because TV people notice everything, no matter how small the detail is. And so this was a huge moment in American political history. So background of this: Richard Nixon, who is pictured on the right, holding his nose with a looks like a tissue or a cloth. Nixon, before this debate, he was in the hospital for 2 weeks. He was sick and he lost 20 pounds and looked tired. What ended up happening is that he cracked his knee, I believe, and it just caused an infection, and he was bedridden, so he couldn't go out and campaign. He looked awful. And because of television, many Americans were able to see the candidates in action for the first time, which helped Kennedy win the election. Kennedy, pictured to the left, he's more youthful. He looks energetic. He looks like he is confident in his body posture. Looks matter, whether you like it or not. And so basically, let me go back real quick. And this was a moment in which many millions of people were watching TV. I think at the time, roughly 90 million people watched TV, and most Americans thought that Kennedy did a better job on TV. However, radio listeners thought that Richard Nixon did the job here. And so, Kennedy ended up becoming president, and